Hello, I'm Pete. Welcome. I'm co-founder and CTO here at Instant.io. Really appreciate everyone who's joined us this evening, today, depending on where in the world you are. Super excited to have you all here. This is the first ever webinar or kind of live event in our four-part series, so Redefining Instant Management. Super excited to be getting into this, and it's intended to cover a lot of the topics that we talk about all the time, like internally to the company and with our customers, and we thought it was about time to talk about some a bit more openly as well. So super excited to be getting into that today. I think the rationale for doing this really is that building an incident management product means that we as a company have a really front row seat to the way that the companies in the world that are kind of leading the charge are handling incidents and the way that that is changing. And part of our role, as we see it, is to help customers accelerate that. And I think that's fantastic for the company, that's fantastic for the customers we speak to, but for loads of people outside of that sphere, you don't get as much access to that. So we wanted to reflect on the hundreds of thousands of incidents that we've helped customers solve and share, I guess, some of the learnings and some of the trends that we're seeing in the industry. Let's see how it goes. It's a bit of an experiment. I'm super, super excited to get into it. Before we, I guess, dive in to topics, we'd love to cover just a little bit of housekeeping. So in a minute, I'm going to invite Lisa up, and we'll talk more about that in just a second. But to set the tone, the event's going to be about 45 minutes. I'm sure if Lisa and I got into it, we could talk for far, far longer, but I'm not going to subject you to that. We can't see or hear the audience, which is very unnerving, but we can see the chat function and we can see Q&A. So feel free to chat as you go. There's a couple of other folks from the team here. They'd be more than happy to riff with you guys. And we're going to make some time at the end for questions. So please put things in the Q&A and we'll keep an eye on that. And Lisa and I would love to answer questions at the end. However, first, I would love to cover some topics that are sort of near and dear to our heart. And for that, I'd like to invite Lisa up to the stage. I think, I'll let Lisa, hi Lisa, talk a bit more about herself in a second, but to set the scene, Lisa was one of the first people that I kind of asked to come and join Instant.io and take a crazy leap with, at that point, barely a product, sort of no investment, no nothing. So she's had a really front row seat to every customer we've brought on, every incident we've ever had. She's caused her fair few, as have I. And I guess as folks that have tackled hundreds of incidents in our careers and seen customers run essentially hundreds of thousands of these things, I think I really, really wanted to get Lisa's voice in on this one, and I know firsthand that she has lots of very strong opinions, and I'm looking forward to hearing them. Lisa, I guess before we jump in, might be helpful for everyone just to share a little bit of context on kind of what you do now and kind of your role in the team, because I think that sets the scene quite nicely for some of the topics we're going to talk about. So I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, hi everybody. Very excited to be here. This is my first webinar, so we'll see how that goes for everyone. So yeah, I've spent most of my time in the response product and focusing on how people respond to incidents. How can we build a product that is delightful and useful in that kind of moment of high stress? And I think that's something that I've always really enjoyed, because the stakes are high in that you're interacting, the product that we build, someone is interacting with at a moment where things are not going to plan and they're not feeling great. And that means that you've got a chance to really delight them and make their day if you get it right. Also, absolutely a chance to make them hate you if you get it wrong. But I kind of enjoy that kind of slightly more high stakes part of the product. And also thinking about what I would have wanted, because these are all the tools. I basically get to spend my day building things that I have wanted for my whole career. And that's really exciting. And whether that's stuff to help with the really big, high severity, 20 people in a room incidents, or whether it's stuff to help with just the little bugs and sort of day-to-day noise that happens in a team. I think it's really interesting thinking about how do you build something that works for both those groups of people, for bigger companies, for smaller companies, and for those people who are in that really high stress moment. So yeah, that's me, and I'm kind of excited to get into it.
Nice, likewise. And I think sort of topically, I thought we would start with home turf for you and talk a bit about response. So I think you mentioned there that incidents are high stakes, they're high risk, they're high stress. And I think the reason that I wanted to cover this one first is that I think that is traditionally how everyone sees incidents historically, right? It's the old way is they're major issues that typically happen infrequently. They're complex, they're hard to navigate. And I think what we've seen is a real trend in the other direction there, which is incidents being something, anything that takes you away from unplanned work with a degree of urgency, whether big or small. I guess you have driven a large amount of the, I guess, like culture change that we've had at Instant IO, and a similar one that we've seen in other companies where it's like, let's try and treat as many things as possible as incidents. I guess like why do that is a question that I would be asking if I didn't already know the answer. So yeah, I like would love any thoughts you've got on that.
Yeah, so I think I can't tell whether I always believed this or whether I've like eaten my own Kool-Aid a little bit. But at the beginning of the company, fairly obviously, we had this new product and we wanted to be using it as much as we could. So we were like, we're going to dog food it, and we're going to dog food it for everything. And I think we kind of thought at the time that we'd probably pushed the boat out a bit too far there, and that wasn't really how our customers should really use our product in the real world. And then, sort of doing it, we discovered that actually it just felt really good, not just from the point of view of all of the dog fooding and the stuff we were learning about our own product, but also as a way of codifying the way that you do reactive work. And particularly in the early days, a lot of our sort of selling points and the way that we were building relationship with customers was all about providing really, really great support and building those really good relationships with customers. And actually using incident response as a framework, doing all the same things that you do for a critical incident, but sort of in microcosm, works really, really well for those smaller incidents, and really helps you to build trust. So that's communicating really clearly internally and externally, making sure you're showing you're working so that everyone else in the team can learn from it, so that you're spreading the knowledge of how you actually debug this stuff. Thinking about being really clear with both the team, but also like bluntly yourself about where you are in the phase of an incident, and do you understand what the problem is, and are you trying to fix it, or are you monitoring it? And all of that hygiene just made us better at responding to those smaller, like unplanned bits of work. And I think then what we found is we started talking to customers about it, and they were kind of like, "Oh yeah, actually, this kind of works for me too." And now that we sort of 2-3 years on from that, I can now sort of understand the reasons for that, which is it's about applying structure to reactive work. And if you're in a normal environment where you don't have that structure, it ends up being happens quietly in the corner. It's often very invisible to the team, to management, and the result of that is that you end up with sort of this invisible workload that's dragging your team, and you can't see it and you can't talk about it. And no one really knows who's doing it and why and for who. And I think that incident management and good incident management tooling is a really good way of like pulling that stuff out in the open. And then you can interrogate it and be like, oh, why is this particular integration cause so many incidents? Like, do we need to do some investment there? You can start to prioritize, and you're just seeing so much more, and then being much more structured in the way that you fix and communicate about this stuff.
Yeah, 100%. I think one of the things that in my role, sorry, I had a bit of lag there. Lisa, can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah, I think you're all good now.
Okay, brilliant. Sorry, I just had a moment of cut out. The irony of having an incident during a live event about incidents is not lost on me. But maybe we can use this. I'm sure the social team will have a field day. But yeah, I think one thing that I've noticed as well that I've particularly appreciated in my role, I guess, as CTO, is like, why do I want more of these small incidents? I think for all the reasons that you've said, for sure. I think one of the things that has happened before as well is like kind of like the small incidents that then become big incidents, like the snowballs, and being able to like catch those when they're tiny and like have everything already there when it's like a tiny fire that suddenly erupts into like a flaming inferno. And if you've already got a fire extinguisher on site, like that's incredibly useful. And I think that I've found very interesting as well. As kind of, we've had a number of ones where it's like, oh, it's probably nothing, but let's just declare an incident anyway. And then it's like, oh my God, this is very not nothing. And also help, please. And that's where I think it's been, super interesting seeing that philosophy sort of lead to a better outcome, even for major incidents, not just for smaller ones.
Yeah, the other thing I just thought of is it's also about learning your tooling. So where I've been in the past, you don't do your incident process until something's really wrong, and that means you're both having to fix some of the most difficult issues and learn all your tooling at the same time. Whereas if you use your tooling every day, then it's just sort of like your tooling times 10, which is much easier, where you're kind of using all of it, versus being like, I don't know what we call incidents. I don't know what severities are. I don't know what a lead role is. Like you don't want to be discovering all of that stuff while your website's down.
Yeah, 100%. I think like one thing that maybe just like came into my head while you were talking about all of that is kind of familiarity with tooling, totally agree that's really important. And I think, one of the reasons that a lot of people wouldn't declare more incidents, or you wouldn't take the philosophy that you've just gone with, is essentially like your processes are just a bit rubbish. And so it's like really painful to do that. I'm gonna swerve the bias of someone that literally runs an incident management product company. But like if we talk about, for example, like something that we hear all the time from customers, right, is the post-mortem process is really, really painful, right? It's like we treat incidents so seriously that if we did that for 10 things a day, we would never do any other work. I guess sort of like maybe for the benefit of folks that are maybe in that position, like how do you and the team view this? Like, because like I know for a fact that you don't follow a super comprehensive, detailed post-mortem on absolutely every single incident we have. That would be insane. So like, how do you balance that? How do you figure out, like, I guess, how to have a response to that CTO who's like, I don't want to pay the cost on every incident?
So I think it's about having an adaptive process. So with most things, with most processes, like if we think about how you run a project, some projects are going to take 6 months and you're going to be really, really structured and detailed and plan them. And other projects are going to take 4 days. And essentially someone's going to put their headphones on, write up a really quick plan and come up with something sensible. And we're used to the idea that we have different muscles for delivering projects. And I think incidents are just the same thing, where you want to have different amounts of essentially bureaucracy and paperwork, and also empower the people responding to the incident to push back if they don't feel like it's adding value. Like we've all written a post-mortem where we were sat for 4 hours staring at Notion being like, why am I doing this with my life? I'm doing it to tick a box because my manager told me to. And as soon as you're there, you've totally lost. And you've lost all of the engagement from responders. And that's the point where people will stop declaring incidents because they don't want to do the paperwork. Whereas if you say, hey, do you think a postmortem would be useful here? And someone's like, nah, then, maybe you challenge them if you disagree. But maybe you just say, okay, cool, well, let's move on with our day. And I think it's just about making sure you have those different muscles and you can use them in the right way. Equally, if you end up in a culture where you never write any postmortems, even when everything is on fire, that's probably also a problem that you've got to talk about.
Yeah, I think both extremes are bad, right? And I think the key is like having a process that just like ability and is adaptive to whatever type of incident you're running. I think like one thing you mentioned there is like the cost of writing the postmortem, or the effort involved. I think like I'd love to move us on to thank you for slides, automation. So like this is an area where I guess like the idea of lots of manual effort and lots of pain sort of just particularly in 2024 just starts to scream LLMs and AI and all sorts of other exciting buzzwords. I think applied in the context of incidents, it's an interesting topic, and I think we should talk about it a bit because it's something we've seen coming from customers. It's something we've worked on internally ourselves. Kind of, I guess, in the old world, if incidents are manual, rely on people following some flowchart in a Google Doc, and the new world is one where we're kind of trying to figure out how to use the chat GPTs of the world, how to use like AI and pattern matching. Like, between those two, like the second one definitely sounds better, but it's not free and it doesn't come without cost and it doesn't come without trade-offs. I think talking about some of those would probably be interesting, or I think so. If not, people in the chat can tell us to move on. I think like there's a school of thought that says AI is just going to replace everything. What would you say to people who say that? It's like, why even build this product in 10 years time, like 5 years time? AI is just going to do it all. Like, why are there not loads of AI only incident management products already on the market? I guess would be a question that I think is interesting.
Yeah, so I think the way that I've seen AI be successful, and it's possible that is because of the limitations of our current LLMs. And as LLMs get better, this won't be true anymore. But like my current view is that AI is really, really good at augmenting humans and making humans faster, more reliable, and overall like much better incident responders. And I think we've obviously got some AI features in our product that we've built, and the stuff that we found that really resonated with people was like a little bit of kind of magic here and there to just grease the wheels and keep things moving. And I think that is also what automation has always done. So if we think about automation and AI as being not so dissimilar, this is like the same way that you have a little alias or you have a little script that you run to lock the master branch. That's automation. We've been able to do that for years and years. Maybe at some point you just tell AI to lock the master branch in your phone and it does it. But it's still kind of the same thing where you as the human are in the driving seat. the reason that I think that is I don't think we're going to get to a point where we have AI that is good enough and trustworthy enough. So if we think about like hallucinations, for example, do you want to give AI the kinds of power that you give your engineers on your team around, root credentials to your database? Because if that goes wrong, you're going to have real egg on your face and you're going to be going back to your customers saying, oh, so the AI bot dropped the database and we're really sorry and it's going to take us 8 hours to restore from the
The
backup.
new blame the intern, isn't it? It's
Yeah,
sorry,
and
our
like,
AI just deleted all your data. Our bad.
but I think it's also like the risk there, the risk reward just isn't right. Whereas the risk reward of getting an AI that gobbles up all of the information from all of your incident channels, from all of your docs, and like tells you, hey, the last time somebody had this problem, they ran this command and it did this, and providing all that context in a really useful way, like that feels like I'm a superpower. I'm now like a superhuman who can do all of this stuff 10 times faster, but there's still a human in the loop who is checking, who's understanding, who's maybe prompting the AI to say, oh, okay, I kind of think we need to look at the database. Can you pull up the logs? And I think that's the kind of, Iron Man version of this that I see, which is the thing that's changing is you're no longer typing, you're probably talking. You're probably talking to something that has a lot of context about your organization specifically, that you've trained on the data that you have and the other humans that are in your organization. And so you suddenly have the collective knowledge of everyone in your team at your fingertips, rather than having to learn that and onboard onto a team. So I think that's the amazing future that I see. But it's not, I'm just going to give the keys to my database to the AI.
Yeah, 100%. I think sort of to sort of show behind the curtain a little bit. I don't have. This is where I would love it. A lovely slide with some nice analytics and graphs of our AI usage. But it's like one of the things that we've seen in just in terms of behavior change in what our customers did before they used Instant IO, but also using Instant IO. So sort of forget our product for a second. Like, is that the number one use cases that people are using this stuff for is the like it's the grunt work, the stuff that's just like I need to go through 1,000 Slack messages and try and pull out some useful piece of information. It's not actually the like I want you to be really smart and restart my Kubernetes cluster or anything like that. It's the can you help me with the thing I have to do in every incident 10 times? That's the things that people actually reach for first. If you look at what they actually do versus what people say they want, actually exactly what you've just described. I think literally have the graphs to prove it. So that's been super interesting because that was not my expectation coming in, right? It's like my expectation was that people would want that chat GPT experience, that like magic, give it to an AI and everything just works, and very much not the case. So yeah, principles of exoskeletons, not robots, going very strong at Instant IO, and working really well. Let's move on to communication. So this is something where we were literally talking about our status page the other day, right? For an issue we were having with a third party, and it's something that I think every organization has to wrestle with and struggle with, which is like how much should you be communicating with customers during an incident? And I think there are zealots at both ends of the spectrum. I think if I try and draw a distinction between old and new, I think historically, and certainly when I first became an engineer, you would never talk to your customers about incidents, right? They're something to be hidden. They're something to be ashamed of. They're, maybe you email some people on closed channels. You have like an angry account manager somewhere. And in general, talking about incidents publicly is a sign of weakness. It's something to avoid. Whereas like the new world, you're seeing tons of people being way more open with like their incidents and their outages and following up after. And I think, just personally, like Monzo was really good at this. The culture there was exceptional. Like you can read some absolutely fascinating posts about how we managed to like fuck up or mess up, a load of Cassandra clusters. And like, there's these incredible write-ups, right? And one of our customers is Etsy, who were doing that long before anyone else was doing that. And they had amazing write-ups and they got rightly applauded for that. I think we're seeing more and more people both head in that direction and want to head in that direction. No one's forcing them. Something is making them want to do that. And I think, that's maybe a good first kicking off point, which is like, why does everyone suddenly care about being more transparent, being more open, talking about their incidents? Any thoughts on that, Lisa?
So I think if you put yourself in the shoes of a team where something has gone horribly wrong, so let's say your whole platform is down, and internally you're like, we know it's going to be down for an hour. we've got to we've got to restore from a backup we know it's going to take about an hour.
Yeah.
I think that like you've got two options there, right? You can either tell people or not tell people. And historically, people largely voted for not telling people. And there are pros and cons of that, right? The pros are that the people who aren't trying to use your product don't know, and they probably never find out. Maybe that's kind of saving face. Maybe it saves you SLA credits, whatever it is. The cons of that approach are there are some number of people who are very much aware that your stuff is down, and they feel like you are cheating because you're not telling them what's going on. And they don't know what to do. So they don't know whether you're going to be up in 5 minutes or an hour. And they will probably take to social media and they will scream about you. And I think probably that is the single sort of biggest change here, is that people's behavior when those things go wrong has changed from sort of accepting that software goes down and that's just the world we live in, to actually a world where most software works most of the time. And the expectation is that software is available 24/7. Like the days of, weekend maintenance windows are gone. And so if something's down, you go onto Twitter and you moan about it and you say, hey, why is this thing down? What's happening? And when you're in that situation, if you get ahead of it and you communicate, then you can totally change the conversation. So I think like Etsy, as you said, and also like Linear, I think we're really good at this. Linear recently had an issue where they ended up having to do a rollback and they sort of took lots of their platform down for a couple of hours. And they communicated really clearly during the incident. They sent write-ups to everybody who was affected. It was all very transparent. And the result of that was both, as a customer, I knew what to do and what would and wouldn't work and how to sort of plan my day. And I also trusted that they would tell me if something similar happened again. I trusted that they were fixing it. Like I knew somebody knew and was trying to fix it. And I also thought they were good engineers because it's become a proxy for really good engineering culture. Because if you are good engineers, then probably the postmortem isn't going to make you look that stupid, because it was probably a few different weird things that happened all on the same day. Might make you look really stupid.
Yeah, I was going to say, you'd hope.
But like, if you can communicate about it well and you can talk about the various things that you've done, both in terms of how you fix the issue, but also what you've done kind of looking forwards, I think that you can get to a point where you're really building trust with your customers, particularly if you have technical customers who are looking and suddenly they're empathizing with you. They're not judging you. They're not angry. They're like, oh man, I would hate to be that. I would hate to have woken up to that today. I'm really, really glad that my app's fine. And I'm sending you like hug ups or whatever it is. And that just can't happen if you've not got that communication.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's a real kind of, there's like a sort of curve of how much gratitude you get or how much trust you build. And it's sort of, there's a point where sort of you start with no news is good news and you end up being like, well, no news is highly suspect because, everyone has issues. Like there's just no way that you've had nothing go wrong. And so now I start to go like, well, if you're not going to tell me, do I need to check? Do I need to poke? And that's where you get a kind of, if you've got a 5-year history of no incidents, I just flat out don't believe you, right? And I think anyone that's worked in a company where maybe they've swept an incident under the rug knows that is likely what's happening. And so, yeah, I think the trust building exercise is a really, really strong point. And I think it's kind of, for an organization, particularly like you said, a technical one, or if you have a technical product, like one of the easiest ways to build trust is just to be open and kind of honest about what's going wrong. And sort of, you won't always get, I think one thing to call out is like, you won't always get the reception that you necessarily hope for there. And sort of, I've been militantly like everything should be, we should publish, we should talk about status pages, talk about incidents on a status page. And I think one of the things that maybe curbed my enthusiasm for an open incident world was like my experience in larger enterprises, where particularly when there's like a lot of money on the line or a really, really fragile relationship on the line, or there's a competitor that's nipping at your heels who will use every opportunity to kind of, slate you in the eyes of the customer. Like actually there are quite material and often very commercial trade-offs that you're making there. And a well-meaning engineer like me in that position potentially puts the company in a really difficult one. I think are there any other considerations that like you would flag? I know like we've talked about this, right? Like we have the conversation of, is this status page worthy? And generally our bias is obviously yes, but there are circumstances where you also have to layer in a bit of like, how will this be interpreted, right? Will people understand that this isn't actually a big deal? We're trying to be open, or will they proxy, well, every other incident on the status page is only there when it's really, really bad. So this must be really, really bad. And actually you kind of suffer from being trying to lead the charge and be a first mover. Are there any other things that you've heard come up with customers where sort of they've been nervous to do this or nervous to embrace this, or anything, folks that are maybe listening should think about before going back and being like, pitchforks for open incidents with their leadership team?
Yeah, so I think one thing that can be really challenging is when you don't have a lot of clarity. So when you understand exactly what the problem is, you roughly know how long it's going to take you to fix it, you roughly know what the impact is, you're in a really good place to update your status page with something that is useful and not going to like induce panic. But there are some incidents where, at least for the first part, you can be in a place where actually you don't have very many facts. You have like some alerts firing. It's possible that no one's noticed. It's possible that everybody's noticed. It could be anything in between. And you don't really have anything useful to say other than like, I think maybe the database is a bit sad. And that's a really difficult message, because then you're portraying a sense of like, everybody should be worried, but we don't really know how worried. You can't really tell your customers what they should do because you don't know what they should do. And so I think that we need to think carefully about making sure we wait until we have enough clarity that it's like a meaningful message, or putting something that's very deliberately not meaningful, of just saying like, we think something's happening and we don't know, and we're really trying to figure it out as quickly as we can, and we'll be back with you in 10 minutes with more information. And then I think the other thing that we've seen is competitors really go after each other on this stuff. And depending on the space you're in, I think particularly if you've got non-technical buyers, it's a bit of an easier sell, where you're like, look, there's loads of red circles on their status page. They're unreliable. You should use us. Look at our status page. Put two pictures next to each other. Like, we know that this gets put into sales decks that get presented to people. And I think that's the most compelling thing to be worried about. Like, that's the thing that I get worried about. And I think it's
it can
really
get
difficult.
pretty vicious as well, right? It's like it's not a hypothetical. Like, we've literally seen it, and seen folks use it against each other, and it's one of the things that we struggle with, right? It's like, how much do we want to encourage this from people, and does that make us, are we actually helping or are we hurting in a world which isn't quite ready for that?
Yeah, and I think it has to be about your competitors and what they do, and you want to be you want to be a bit ahead, but if you are in a different postcode, then it could easily come back to bite you. And you've got to be careful about the understanding your customer base and the way that your customer base is likely to perceive it, and then also what are the things you can do to communicate and soften that and change their perspective on it.
Nice. Yeah, totally agree with that. I'm going to move us on, if that's okay, because I want to talk about learning. We talked briefly about sort of sharing postmortems. Often behind that, there's a lot of interesting debugging and diagnosis that goes on. But that's more on the sort of technical side of things. I think it is also a lot of learning that happens inside organizations, just around like your process, how you resolve incidents, sort of like how you see them, just like the perception internally in organizations, and how, are they a learning opportunity? Are they something to be avoided? I think, to do the kind of old world, new world comparison, I think, in the old world, certainly like my initial experience was like incidents are generally something to be avoided. They're kind of, whether on your status page or internally, evidence of weakness. Maybe like one team having many incidents, everyone kind of looks at the corner of their eye and is like, man, are those guys okay? Like, they don't seem to know what they're doing. And I think that's a culture that probably is all too familiar for a lot of people, which leads to some of the behaviors we've just talked about. I think one trend we've seen with particularly our customers, which makes sense, they're buying us specifically because they care a lot about incidents, but whether you buy us or not, like, companies increasingly are moving towards a world where incidents are seen as kind of a valuable way to learn, both about kind of where your failures might be and how to mitigate them, but also more about your organization. Like, there's nothing that will be more telling about how your organization really works than like, you're losing $1 million a minute at 3 a.m. and you very rapidly find out, who the key people are, who the decision makers are, where your blockers are, where your friction points are. It's an incredibly efficient way in many ways of like flushing out a lot of organizational structure, if not the most painless one. I think kind of how would you reflect on this, Lisa? Like, I guess sort of I've said sort of two things that feel like they're maybe in opposition to each other, which is like, incidents as evidence of weakness is bad, incidents as a way to learn is good, but incidents are still a way to find your weaknesses. Like, how do you think about that? Like, how should we be using them, and how do we kind of, I guess, foster more of an incidents are a good thing culture versus incidents are like something to be frowned upon?
So I think the first thing is, if you can't see the incidents, that doesn't mean they're not there. So kind of going back to the point
Yeah,
that we
very
started
true.
with, like if you don't know they're there, that doesn't mean your organization is fine. It just means you don't know about them. And once you know about them, you can do stuff about them. So the way that I would sort of reframe that is, I think incidents are a really good way of finding weaknesses in both your organization and your systems, whether that is like some kind of technical issue that you've got, or maybe it's, oh, we only have two people in the company who know how this thing works, and one of them was on holiday and the other one was in a pub, and so we just about made it work, but actually it was
And
a little
that's
bit
and
close
that's
to comfort.
totally hypothetical, right,
Yeah,
Lisa? Like,
that
there's never
happened.
actually been a
Absolutely not.
situation where that has practically happened.
Definitely never wrote code while on the phone to somebody in a
Yeah.
pub.
I say
Um,
this, I have literally had Lisa dial in from a pub, not just once, on multiple occasions for incidents at Instant IO. So it's a real scenario. Uh, both resolved excellently, might I add. But anyway, back over to you.
so yeah, I think that they're good ways of seeing that stuff, but you only see them if you're looking for it. So it's really easy to take an incident like the Monzo Cassandra outage. I think is a really good one, which is like Chris Evans, who's our CPO, ended up writing a really good blog post about it while he was at Monzo, and essentially they made a mistake with the configuration of this tool that they were using, and that resulted in some very bad things. And they learned a lot about the tool. And you could easily stop there and be like, okay, I now know how this tool works and I didn't before. And the new way I think that we're sort of talking about here is like, cool, but what about all the other things that you can learn? So we're not just looking at the specific thing that went wrong. Now we can start to look at, and they do in this really great postmortem, like, well, how do we get into this position? Well, that was because we actually don't have very many people on staff who do know about this tool very well. I wonder if that's a thing we can change. And you start to sort of look at the broader impact on, like, particularly when you're thinking about people and process and how did we communicate with customers. Oh, we should probably have some templates of how we do that because we were writing it on the fly and that didn't feel good. And when you start reflecting on all of those things, you suddenly get your sort of like risk reward, or your the scales turn a bit from how bad the incident was versus how much benefit you're getting. And so I think we had a line really early on in our positioning that was called like, don't count your incidents, make your incidents count. Which I stand by as a positioning line, where it's like you're going to have incidents. So what you want to do, I think Pete's internet has finally.
I'm back. I'm
It's all
back.
good.
I'm alive.
Um,
Um, Sorry about that, team.
yeah, like if you're gonna have incidents anyway, you should at least make sure that you get the best value out of them. And step one is knowing that they're happening. And then step two is like really interrogating them and thinking about what you can learn from them without, taking it too far and writing postmortems for no reasons about tiny bugs that nobody cares about. So, there's a middle ground there, but I think it's like the way that I would always think about it is probably you're not doing enough on your most critical incidents, and probably you're doing too much on your smallest incidents. And if you kind of shift the effort, you'll probably learn more from really thinking about those really big moments and also the big near misses, versus like putting that effort into your sort of weekly postmortems that maybe no one is reading and
Yeah.
maybe aren't that valuable.
Yeah, a document is a really nice sort of artifact of evidence, but it's not necessarily sort of proof that you have extracted the value, right? It's like the conversation is often the most useful thing, let alone like the write up. I'm going to move us on to our last point, because I guess we've talked a lot about incidents as like an isolated thing of like, they happen, we learn from them, we use status pages, like all of these behaviors that we're seeing sort of and trends over time in the industry. I think one of the areas that is almost like sort of the most calcified is around sort of monitoring your incident management program, or like monitoring the performance of your team when it comes to incidents. And I think generally, if you look back at how most companies do this, like it's MTT something, right? It's like that's the metric. Some teams use MTTR for like response, mean time to detect, mean time to resolve. Like there's usually somewhere in a deck or a doc a metric that everyone is desperately trying to monitor, and there's definitely a place for those, right? And we should talk about that, because I'm not saying like MTTX is like a bad thing, but I think one of the things I've noticed is like, although some customers do care about this, they're like, this is not the first metric that everyone asked for, right? This was not, when we launched Insights, everyone wasn't clamoring on the door for MTTX metrics. Like that wasn't what they wanted, and I thought that was very interesting. And I guess the question then is like, okay, well, if it's not MTTX or MTTR, like what is it? Like what are the insights that we should be looking at? What are the ways we should be evaluating our incident response in aggregate? And I think that's very interesting. So like I guess like you run a team at Instant IO, you care about this. What do you look at, right? Because I expect every tech lead to be thinking about the performance of their team when it comes to incidents. Like, how do you do that? Like, when I say is everything good, what's the graph you show me? What's the like analysis you'd give me?
So I live in there are two dashboards that I look at. One is the page load dashboard, and that is basically about, are we burning people out? Are people being paged at 3:00 in the morning repeatedly on multiple evenings in a row? And that is about the well-being of the team. So it's not really about the system or the impact, because pages happen for all sorts of reasons. Some of them are customer impacting, some of them aren't. But having a metric of like, how much is my team getting disrupted, I think is really, really important. And then the second one is about workload. So workload is our sort of, we use Slack data to basically try and figure out how long you are spending on this reactive work. And that's the number I've always wanted. And it genuinely makes me excited. And I'm also upset that I can't get it in other places. Like I'd love for sort of to get it about other kinds of work that my team does. But being able to just look at a graph and quantify the feeling of like, oh, it feels like it's been a bit rough for the last 2 weeks. And you see a graph that does that. And you're like, oh, yes.
It's like validation, isn't it? It's like, I'm not just making it up. There's a graph that says it's really bad.
But then also you can cut the data, and that's the magic bit, right? Where you're just like, oh, okay, we've had this massive spike. What's it caused by? Oh, it's this integration or this customer or this deal, whatever it is that's causing that, you can now see it. Whereas before you might get as far as like, this doesn't feel good, but you certainly could never get to like, what was actually the problem.
But why? Yeah.
And I also find that my gut's just not as good as I'd like it to be. Like when the actual data is sort of put up against my gut feeling, I'm sometimes right, but I'm not right often enough to not want the data.
Yeah, absolutely. It's sort of like, you go, it's definitely this. So it can't possibly be that. And it's like, I think it might be that. Totally agree with that. I just had a quick look at Q&A out the corner of my eye, and we've got a bunch of good questions. So I'm going to suggest we move on to those, if that's all right, Lisa. But thanks so much. I'm sort of aware that I pitched this to you as a conversation about interesting incident management topics, and what I've basically done is grill you and Q&A you for about 40 minutes. But I imagine lots of other folks out there at various stages of incident management journey probably really enjoyed that. So thank you so much. Would love for you to hang around for Q&A if that's all right, because I think it'd be great to hear your thoughts on some of these. So just taking a look at the chat, let's maybe talk about Kay's question. I think that's an interesting one. So we were talking about status pages earlier and talking about like what you publish or postmortems and what you write about. And I think if we can get Kay's question up on screen, like Kay's question was like, what's your approach to balancing sort of transparency versus proprietary information? And it's a really good one because, sometimes you can be very open about like what went wrong, and other times you kind of like, it's very difficult or it's very exposing to do that. And also, you talked about technical audiences and non-technical audiences. So that also makes a difference. I guess sort of like, what would be your rubric for like the degree of transparency to go with? Let's maybe start there.
I think the thing I'd start from is anything that's going to change a customer's behavior, they need to know. So that's like the easy bit. So anything that's like, how long are we going to be down? What works? What doesn't work from a customer's perspective? That has to go out. Otherwise, like your comms just aren't really doing their job. I think that you then get into like a murky bit of like, how much information do you give about the why as opposed to the like what is wrong? And I think that is a lot about knowing your audience. So for us, we would often give a lot more information about the why than at a payment provider company like I was at before, where actually your customers don't care at all. They probably don't understand, and you're not adding value. So I think it's got to be tailored to your audience and understanding like who your customers are, who are the people that are on your status page. And also thinking about, what are your red lines about what you're not going to expose to people, because you probably have some, and let's not pretend that those aren't there. And so it's kind of, you've got to try and walk that line, which is obviously going to be a judgment call. But I think the thing to focus on that I would always use to drive it is like, what will change my customers' behavior? is the first thing that you've got
Yep.
to say. And then what will build trust? Is it
Yep.
actually, if you give them a little bit of more information, are they going to feel much more comfortable, or are they going to feel much more stressed?
Yeah, I think like one of the things that I've definitely noticed when it comes to that side of things is like often a bit of paralysis because you're not sure what to post means you don't post anything, and actually that's actively worse. And it's almost better to say we know something is broken, we don't yet know what, we're digging into it, or like a number of our customers have been affected by an incident. You just give like high level overview and say like we have emailed all affected customers, for example. Even things like that, it's like how would they know if they are affected? How would they know if this matters to them? And if you can give people that confidence, it doesn't matter that you're not providing the super granular details at that point. There's time for a post-mortem write-up later where you can think really hard about this, but usually you're doing this when something is on fire. And so stressing about like how much to share and how much not to share in an incident, I wouldn't worry too much. And in the post-mortem, you've got plenty of time to kind of figure out, what degree of information is actually helpful here. I think we've got time for maybe one more from Lucas. I thought this would be an interesting one, which is like, how do you know if an incident is big or small if not every incident has a post-mortem? Which I think is an interesting question. So it's kind of, if you don't really dig into it, how do you know how bad it really was? I think there's probably a number of answers to this. I think sort of from my 2 cents, I think a post-mortem is sort of not the way that you should be, in my view, sort of like digging into and communicating how big the blast radius was. It is useful as a way to sort of double click on that impact. And maybe it's worse than you thought and you find that out through doing the post-mortem. That's potentially an outcome. So maybe it's worth it. But in general, things like blast radius, affected customers, that should all be happening in the context of the incident investigation itself, rather than needing a document to elicit that information. Like that, the document is a way to, it's like tautological, like document what happened. A document is a way to sort of collate all the impact together, versus being the only way that you should be able to sort of push people to dig into the incident itself, if that makes sense. Like it can be a useful forcing function for an investigation, but in theory that shouldn't be necessary. There are other ways to kind of push for that investigation, and the post-mortem becomes sort of the cherry on top, right? It's the evidence of all of your hard work and all of the interesting things that you found. It's maybe just a reframing of how I would look at it. I would expect my team to investigate every bug. The post-mortem as a forcing function sort of shouldn't ideally be needed. But yeah, nice. That just takes us straight to time, and somehow we've managed to lose Lisa, at least on my screen. So she's done. She's done her 45 minutes, and she's off. Thank you so much, Lisa, in your absence. Really, really appreciate it. Timing could not have been more perfect, and the answers similarly excellent as always. And unsurprising, there's a reason that I asked you to come be employee number 2 after all. Thanks so much to everyone for listening. Sorry we didn't get to all the questions. I think hopefully you found this interesting, engaging. It's a series of experiments. We're kind of just trying to open the doors a little bit to some of the things that we've learned, some of the things we've seen. If you are interested in learning more about this stuff, about the product, about incident management, we have tons of free resources. Not trying to, sales pitch you. We're going to put a QR code up on the screen now, and that'll sort of take you to a bunch of other useful materials and references. Otherwise, have a lovely rest of your week, and thanks for tuning in. We really appreciate it.